Buenas tardes y buenos días.
Good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are listening from. Well, to all of you present here, good afternoon. We are going to listen to this next presentation of this doctoral seminar of the Charles V Award. This is the sixth panel presided by María Esther de Campo Garcia, that I'm going to introduce now. She knows us because she has participated in the summer courses of the Yuste Foundation, although this is the first part she participates in our seminar, doctoral seminar. I think we can keep doing things together, María Esther del Campo Garcia, because during the lunches we are hearing many wonderful ideas. She's a full professor at the area of political science and administration, PhD in political science and sociology from the Complutense University of Madrid. She also holds a Master's of Arts in comparative politics from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And she has worked as a researcher and lecturer at several universities: University of London, University of Miami, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and in Ibero-American University of Mexico, University of Lima, Technical University of Machala, the Catholic University of Bolivia in La Paz, Higher University of San Andres Flaxo, Ecuador, among others. She is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science and Sociology of the Complutense University of Madrid. She's following very closely the current situation in Iberoamerica and the political development in Latin America, so I'm sure that the presentation that she's going to be introducing is going to be of high interest for her. Okay, María Esther del Campo, thanks for being in this seminar. The floor is yours. Good afternoon and apologies because this is a very hard time. I don't know, I had to present after lunch. I know it's hard, but that's what it is. I know we don't have much time, but I think it's almost necessary to thank the foundation for the invitation. This is my first doctoral seminar, but I have been the chair of the doctoral seminar of the Ortega and Gasset Foundation. I directed the doctoral program of the university in my university. So I've been directing doctoral seminars for 25 years. So there's something that I don't know whether I should tell you or not. My husband says, don't say it, because it looks terrible. It's like when a doctor says that they did 30 or 8 interventions a day. Well, I have directed hundreds of doctoral studies. So I know that we don't have much time. So what I'm going to do is to summarize my initial intervention, and I'm going to merge my initial intervention and the closing intervention. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is an excellent group of PhD students and PhD holders. Congratulations. I think your work is excellent. And congratulations, Vanessa, of course. I'm in charge of introducing Vanessa Milena Monterroza BALETA. As you have seen in the program, she has worked on international cooperation as proof or evidence of international solidarity. Apologies to the interpreters, I'm talking too fast. And she's going to talk about the cooperation in the European Union in the peace building process in Colombia through the implementation of projects on the right to education. I think the topic is extraordinarily relevant. I will introduce Vanessa before her intervention, and I want to make a couple of comments. Some of the comments have been made by Rosa and Isabel this morning, so I'm going to spare that time devoted to context. My knowledge of the reality of Colombia, in addition to being a professor in some universities in Colombia, is that I have been in charge of cooperation projects in the field. For example, there was a project by the International Cooperation Relief Aid, the Spanish Relief Aid, with Jorge Garay. That's why I was talking about displaced population, because I think it's a very important topic. I also took place in the Peace laboratories, which were the introduction of the cooperation projects that were to follow, and the projects, for example, that we're talking about today. One of the aspects that I presented this morning is we're talking about relief aid or cooperation. We're talking about European cooperation and European cooperation in Iberoamerica or Latin America, and we're talking about average income countries. There's something that I mentioned during lunch. You are analyzing case studies, and that's great because you talk about the details. And if you don't talk about details, it's really difficult to talk about the case. However, we also need a kind of like a bigger picture of those cases. And we need to see the bigger picture to understand what we are talking about. This morning I was telling you how that the interesting thing about the case of Colombia is to see how the European Union carries out cooperation in average income countries. In this case, we're talking about a conflict country. I just finished a paper on Nicaragua, and the thing is that Spain and the European Union in general has a hard time carrying out these cooperation projects. Not so much in the case of Colombia, but there are other cases like Colombia where we're talking about failed states. How can we carry out cooperation when we have very low institutional capacities? How can we carry out cooperation projects when you find that there's certain attitude of closing? There's this closeness. I'm not judging, I'm just assessing. Maybe there are internal endogenous factors that avoid this penetration of cooperation. In the case of Colombia, things become aggravated because we are talking about a country, as you explained this morning, that has gone through a historical process of violence. There have been different solutions. I was talking about the 1991 constitution because it was part of the solution. It was the political incorporation of the M19, but it was useless because then we saw murders of candidates. Violence went on. We are talking about a case of violence that is much more structural than we may conceive. And as donors, just thinking that we may lessen or have a direct impact in the functioning of these institutions, I think it's kind of pretentious. It's a pretentious idea from the perspective of European or Spanish cooperation. Another aspect. Many things are connected to what was said this morning. In a way, I think that cooperation, after the Paris Declaration, cooperation needs to take into account the demands from the recipients. And there we find a basic political component because it's the recipients who identify what the public policy priorities are. And often it's not civil society. Isabel was saying this morning. Civil society may or may not be present in some of these identification processes. But I'm going to say something that was also included in Isabel's presentation. Civil society is not really present in the process of agenda planning, and well, during implementation they are somewhat necessarily present, because they are necessary. Otherwise, it would be impossible to implement the projects. I want to add something else. I tried to be somewhat critical. I tried to play devil's advocate on how things were being proposed. I think that there is another aspect. I'm going to look at it later from the Colombian side. When we talk about European cooperation, when we have tried to improve some problems like corruption or lack of transparency, there's a technocratic view from the Commission on how these projects are going to be managed on the ground. and this makes this econometric vision hinders the participation of civil society in the projects. It's very hard for some civil society organizations to take part. And I want to emphasize, even when there is a political will, and sometimes there's no political will.
So I think that's another problem. When we think about the possible local partners for that cooperation, we see that some entities, some local entities are quite big, as Isabel showed this morning. So on the one hand is a cooperation that wants to be territorialized, but on the other hand, that cooperation, given the bureaucratic and technocratic conditions, becomes extremely complex. So the partners that can really work in that cooperation are always the same. So they are never diverse, and some of the proposals never get to the field. In the case shown by Isabel, this is quite important because we're talking about education, and how come are we not going to land on the field with educational projects? We need local entities for those educational projects, and it is therefore quite difficult. And sometimes we see a divergence between the priorities of the local entities and the priorities of the national government. And if this was not enough, you can imagine that each government has different priorities. We've seen it in Isabel's expositions. So the governments sometimes have priorities that differ from the priorities shown in the international community. They are populist. They follow the populist rhetoric. There are some externalities also in these cooperation projects that have to do with the fact that in many cases the most vulnerable groups, and I'm not talking about the topic here, because when we identify the factors, we do identify the vulnerable groups. But when we try to involve those vulnerable groups, it is very complicated. So sometimes they don't have the capacity to keep on working on the projects. So in that sense, I think it is like a catastrophic type down. This is an expression that we used in Bolivia in 2003, but I have the same feeling with Colombia. So sometimes when we try to develop the sense of, or the principle of solidarity, well, sometimes we are reinforcing some of the structural problems of the institutions. And at the same time, we see the fear of the local entities. Sometimes they fear that we are directly messing around with them and interfering with their tasks. And sometimes you see that this is fundamental, because sometimes we are reinforcing the entities that should not be reinforced because they are negative. So these values that we are talking about need to follow a program, need to adapt to a program. They need to be approved of by the host country, by the host government. The impact of the participation mechanism clashes with the social reality in Colombia. The impact of the mechanisms that are foreseen in the cooperation mechanisms clash with the reality on the ground. I want to tell you that many occasions, in the case of Colombia, the cooperation projects, they are not like floating. They belong to a structure that has already been implemented. The trustee, the trust has already implemented some changes, but the task force that are on the ground are basically working as project managers, and many people complain about it in the field work in Colombia, because in many occasions the intermediate agencies say, there's nothing else I can do. I am managing the projects of the Commission, but this is not what I was meant to do. Some of the managers said, this is not a purse, this is not money just to fund projects. We are not here to distribute the money. No, we want to take part in the priority, in the list of priorities, and then in the implementation of the projects. I am going to sum up what I want to say next. In the case of Vanessa, this is an excellent work. As was the case for the rest of presentations, I think she does a very thorough analysis of the evolution of the cooperation policies in Colombia. The emphasis is legal, because she's a lawyer, and this is the reason for the development of the problem. My recommendation is, I'm not criticizing your work. I just want to comment, and when I comment your works, and when I will comment your work, it's like a piece of advice. I give you my recommendations and my pieces of advice, my advice, because I see it from my perspective, and my perspective might help you. In the case of Vanessa, I had a hard time in identifying the questions that that identified the problem, something that we could compare our conclusions with, because in the paper your conclusions are a bit poor, maybe because you didn't have the time to finish the paper, or because maybe you have not understood the idea that you have to start with a question. You have to start with a question, and your research needs to try and give a reply to that question. There is a lot of effort behind this work. I have learned much about the development of your work, and you have done a huge amount of work in describing the education projects, which is not an easy task. Sorry. So I think that is important for a research project. Another thing that is true, and I want to say this to you now in case it is useful, in Latin America, and especially after the Constitution, there is a very important recognition of the diversity and the multilingualism. And I think it would be important to note to what extent, and that would be important because it would help identify the specificities of the beneficiary countries. So I was saying, to what extent in the countries you are studying, you identify the characteristics that are specific to the Colombian population. Of course, aside from the identifying the projects, maybe you could go deeper into that subject matter. I'm going to introduce Vanessa. And it is really worth to have her here and to listen to her because she can complement Isabel's exposition, Isabel's presentation, because with both we will have a clear picture of Colombia. She has a PhD in law, government and public policy, and holds an MA in governance and human rights from the Autonomous University of Madrid. She has a master in law with emphasis on public law by the External University of Colombia. She's a specialist in planning and management of development cooperation interventions by the Center for Higher Education Studies of the Organization of Ibero-American States, OEI. She's a lawyer by the University of Cartagena, and she also works in practical work. She is now a legislative advisor to the Congress of the Republic of Colombia, and she has she can have a very high influence in that. So congratulations for your work. Thank you. You have the floor.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I need to thank the Yuste Foundation, the opportunity they've given me. It is a privilege for me to be here with you. It was a privilege for me being able to listen to you and listening to the recommendations from the jury. So qualified, so knowledgeable in these subject matters. My intervention will focus on the contribution of the European Union to the peace-building process in Colombia after the implementation or starting or through the implementation of projects with an educational intention. In Colombia, there is a peace agreement that was signed 5 years ago. However, the signing of the agreement was just the beginning of the peace-building process. So we must distinguish the signing of the agreement and the peace-building process. We must distinguish both things, both phases, because the peace-building process is the real thing. The peace-building process in Colombia is not an easy task, as Isabel told us this morning, and when Rosa explained the context of the peace process in Colombia. Colombia has been in conflict for in its recent history as a republic, so the peace-building process is quite difficult. But for the peace-building process, in the peace-building process, there are several actors, one of them being international cooperation, which is clearly not the only one. The Colombian institutions have much responsibility in the process, but I want to highlight the role of the international cooperation in that peace building. And for that, I will split my intervention in two halves. In the first part, I will talk about the legal basis for the legal cooperation in the European Union. I will talk about the goals of the cooperation and how they relate to the principle of solidarity. We will talk about the mechanism for international cooperation used by the European Union and how they relate, how they work with Latin America. So I would talk in legal terms. I would talk about the legal foundation of this cooperation. Secondly, I will talk about the peace building process in Colombia. This structure is different from the one in my paper, because in the paper I started with the context of the peace building process and evolution of the contribution of the European Union, the peace labs, and the European Fund for Peace. And finally, I would talk about the cooperation projects that are now ongoing, with a special emphasis on guaranteeing the right to education. Since this morning we have already talked about the main items of this first part, I will just cover the main structure. I don't think this is working.
Entonces empecemos.
So, we can start with the first half of my presentation. So, the legal construction of the notion of cooperation. The Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union says in Article 4 that the European Union can have a cooperation policy. It is a function that is shared between the European Union and the member states, meaning that apart from the cooperation aid offered by the European Union, each of the member states can also offer cooperation aid. Article 208 of the same treaty says that this cooperation has a goal, which is to reduce the poverty and to eradicate the poverty eventually. So this is the goal of cooperation as said in the treaties that can lead us to think, to wonder why the European Union wants to help in the peace-building process in Colombia and how that will help to reduce or eradicate poverty. This is the question that I have used as a basis, and I have used the case law of the Court of European Justice, because the Court has devised a broader notion of conceptuality that justifies the presence of the European Union in places like Colombia. The Court of European Justice worked in a case that demanded a framework agreement for cooperation between the European Union and the Republic of the Philippines. And the judges said that that potential framework agreement could not work on things such as transport or environment or readmission of nationals of third states, because that was beyond the scope of the cooperation initiatives of the European Union. That's why the court coined the notion, broader international cooperation, as I was saying. In Article 2008, this needs to be interpreted in conjunction with Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union that sets up the goals of the external affairs of the European Union. So they say that this goes beyond the simple reduction or eradication of the poverty and sets up the new framework for cooperation of the European Union. Article 25 says that, for example, the protection of rights, the strengthening of the democracy, the realization of the principle of solidarity were also important and should be included in the scope. The Court of Justice then started to define that broader notion of the principle of solidarity. And that was called the European vision of the development, not just the foundation for the cooperation, but also the European vision of the notion of development. So that European vision of development is based on the joint declaration made in relation to the subject matter of cooperation for development. When the Court of Justice spoke, the European consensus of development was enforced. This is the second element of my presentation. It was 2005. So the development policy of the European Union worked towards the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals, not just the notion of the principle of solidarity. It was because the principle of solidarity encompassed many more things in a broader sense. So that joint declaration of 2017, Our World, Our Dignity, Our Future, was no longer working towards the Millennium Development Goals, but the Sustainable Development Goals, but always working towards the concept of the development according to the sense given to it by the European Union and shaped by the ongoing joint declarations. This is what now prevails, not just what is included in the treaties. Look at the latest joint declaration working towards the Sustainable Development Goals. It has become the roadmap for the cooperation goals of the European Union.
Es que no alcanzo a ver. Bueno, en fin, yo voy a continuar. La acción exterior de la Unión Europea.
So the cooperation of the European Union shows that the goals of cooperation are not just justified by the broad notion of cooperation for development, but also in the values of the European Union. In the preamble of the treaties, the word cooperation and the term principle of solidarity are mentioned. That's what explains why cooperation is such an important element in the field of cooperation. In 2019, the European Union was given 0.48% of the total budget to international cooperation. In 2020, it was 0.50%. The goal is to increase it to 0.70. That means that aside from the broad notion of cooperation, their interest is to directly develop one of the main principles of the European Union. Thank you. Now this works. The pointer works. So this principle of solidarity of the European Union, we need to understand it based on the solidarity categories. These days, we've seen that solidarity can be understood in two different ways: inner solidarity and outer solidarity. The inner solidarity manifests itself with the solidarity clause that Marie mentioned in her presentation. But there is another type of solidarity, outer solidarity, the second type of solidarity. And this is where cooperation, international cooperation for development, fits in. But solidarity has a double dimension. It is part of the broad notion of international cooperation as stated by the Court of Justice based on Article 21, and it is also a value and a principle of the European Union itself.
Up until now, we were talking about the enlarged concept of international cooperation for development developed by the Justice Tribunal of the European Union. We talked about the two types of solidarity, internal solidarity and external solidarity, within and outside the European Union. Then we talked about the two dimensions of solidarity in terms of international cooperation for development. On the one hand, in agreement with what's established in Article 21 of the European Union Treaty, and on the other hand, in agreement with the contents of its preamble. This said, we are going to talk about the framework of the principle of solidarity in the context of the theories of realism and idealism. These theories, from the point of view of international relations, can be applied to the principle of solidarity that we have been discussing. The realist theory indicates that states have relationships with the purpose of obtaining benefits. No state would have a relationship with another one for altruist purposes. There's always an interest that can be geopolitical, among others. Then we have the idealist position based on which there could be altruist purposes in the relationships between states. If we focus on these theories and the principle of solidarity that we have been talking about during these days, we may identify that from the viewpoint of the treaties, as we mentioned, the altruistic approach is the one that is present in the texts. Article 21, for example, based on which the expanded concept of cooperation for development talks about principles like solidarity, respect of fundamental rights, respect of the rule of law. So, in theory, based on those treaties, we would have to position ourselves in the idealistic current. But we should wonder whether this cooperation for development that the European Union puts forward does or does not generate benefits for the European Union. In my view, the cooperation union put forward by the European Union, although it's based on solidarity and it has all these altruistic purposes, it's also going to generate benefits for the Union. What we should focus on is whether those benefits are an end on themselves or whether they are a consequence. I think that it's a second option. We should never forget that the principle of solidarity is the framework of cooperation for development, because as we already said, it is part of the values of the European Union. But that doesn't mean that this does not generate benefits for the Union. Having partners makes you stronger, and when you have partners with which you share values, you can build a global model that reflects those values that are the reason why the European Union was created and the values that it stands for. So for us to interpret those benefits under the light of the content of the treaties, we would have to identify that those benefits are a consequence and not an end. That's how it has been recognized in the last shared statement of the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. It is said that cooperation for development makes the Union stronger, and it allows it to implement its ends externally. So we can find a middle ground between those two currents, the idealist and the realistic currents. In the last years, there's a theory that has become stronger. This theory says that cooperation is oriented towards security. And this has been mentioned based on all those security instruments of the Union, those instruments that establish the budget that makes it possible to materialize that foreign policy of the Union. But just the concept that these instruments have become unified does not involve that the European Union lost its principle of idealism in its relationships with third states. The third point of the first part, and this is something that will serve us to give a context to the second part of the presentation, is connected to the mechanisms used by the EU in its cooperation. We can identify three types: bilateral cooperation that may be carried out directly with the state or with international bodies, for example, the Andes community. The second one is carried out through theme elements, where one single theme is developed in different states. And finally, the third point that is the most relevant to my presentation is this third mechanism, the trust fund. The trust fund is an interesting mechanism in the framework of the European Union's cooperation, because it allows to pool the European Union's efforts and the efforts of the member states in one single effort. It allows to avoid duplication of efforts and to make a European cooperation more efficient. In the case of Colombia, in addition to the EU mission, we have cooperation missions from different countries, Germany, Spain, etc. And we even have regional missions, missions from regions of Spain. So the trust fund is a very interesting mechanism because it makes it possible to join forces or to pool those efforts, and that makes cooperation more efficient without any doubt. Finally, the last point of this fourth part is aimed at giving context to the cooperation of the European Union in Latin America, with special emphasis in Colombia. I'm not gonna elaborate on this, but I just want to make some brief comments. We can see how there are different periods in cooperation. International cooperation, initially, European cooperation, that is, was limited to the territories of the European Union states outside the European Union, of overseas territories of member states. Then after the 70s, there's a focus put in Latin America, and authors like Eric Tremolada say that this first stage was shy, and from those there's a shift to another period between 1980 and 1989 where there's a change, and there's an important shift. The European Union starts developing cooperation, peace-building cooperation in Central America. This becomes the first precedent in this type of conflicts. And there's a milestone event that, without any doubt, will become a catalyst for relationships between Latin America and the European Union, which is the the inclusion of Spain and Portugal in the European Union. This implies a focus on those countries. Teresa Freixas said so in her presentation. With Brexit, we lost that communication, that transatlantic communication channel. But the fact that Spain and Portugal belong to the European Union keep this connection alive in a certain way. And this connection is very important for the... Sorry, this period was very important for the development, the future development of cooperation between the European Union and Latin America. So, what triggered these common relations in addition to this fact that I just mentioned? There's one first element that I identified, which is common values, shared values between the European Union and most Latin American countries. Most Latin American countries are organized under a form of state of law that coincides with one of the elements that the European Union wants to develop in its cooperation policies. Another element are the changes, the exchanges between both regions. On the one hand, the European Union has become a major bloc that's interested in developing political, economical relationships with other states. That shift in the vision of foreign policies has, without any doubt, generated an interest in having relationships with Latin America. On the other hand, Latin America strengthened its economies, becoming a market that is attractive for the European Union. Also, many states that up until then looked like dictatorships transitioned to democracy, which built a bridge in terms of sharing values. And there's a third point that triggered these relationships, which is connected to the increase of interregional relationships. The EU and the Andes community are created around the same time. However, the evolution process of the European Union cannot be compared with the other entity. But in the beginning, both blocs have the same ideas, which facilitated relationships. So this takes me to the end of the first part of my presentation. We have talked about the legal grounds for European cooperation. This expanded concept elaborated by the Court of Justice, we have talked about two types of solidarity, internal and external solidarity, and how the cooperation of the EU is based on solidarity, but it doesn't mean that there are no benefits. But these benefits are a consequence and not a purpose. This interpretation is the only one that is feasible if we take into account the principles of cooperation established in the treaties. In this second part, we will focus on the peace process in Colombia. I will briefly mention some of the points because I already mentioned some of these points briefly, so I will just make a few notes. going to start with this point. The EU cooperation in Colombia has a milestone, 2011. That's when the Office of Cooperation of European Cooperation was established. The mission, sorry. When the mission is established in 2011, that's when we have a milestone there that will trigger relationships. Cooperation with Colombia has happened through two mechanisms: regional and bilateral mechanisms and peace building. Isabel already mentioned this. Peace laboratories were the precedent of the trust fund. That is, the EU cooperation in Colombia in the field of peace is not new. There's a precedent, which are the peace laboratories that we already mentioned. And what's important about these two mechanisms is that the development model that was addressed is maintained. It's a model that focuses on development and not a military approach. Previously, Colombia had a partnership with the U.S., and the U.S. cooperation approach was militaristic. So this new approach also involved the implementation of a peace-building approach, because the idea is that the conflict does not end with the signature of the treaty. It is understood that for the armed conflict to finish, there is a need to build capacity in society for people to continue their lives in adequate conditions. The peace process in Colombia has not been easy. In fact, we are in the stage of implementing the agreement. The signature that did not involve automatically that peace would happen in Colombia. Such a long conflict with so many elements would not finish with the treaty. The treaty was just the point of departure and the structure that would allow to build peace in the country.
Yo acá les traje algunas imágenes.
Here we have some images that make it possible that give context. And one of the elements that caught the international attention is that after a long process of negotiation, the peace treaty was signed. Here we have the president at that point and the chief of the FARC, and we see the international community around them. And then there was a voting. And this second image represents polarization. Here we have the president with a sign that says yes. He was the president at the time, Juan Manuel Santos, who triggered the peace dialogues. And then we have Álvaro Uribe, who opposed the peace dialogues. And he said that the peace dialogue would generate impunity for the victims. That's what he stated. The plebiscite process was very complex and no one. This was a great challenge legally to try to justify the feasibility of this peace agreement that in a way had not been supported by the people, because the no was the option that won. The process was renegotiated and some new points were included. This was mentioned yesterday. And finally, a second agreement was signed. The first one was signed in Cartagena, and the second one was signed in Bogota, in the Colón Theater. That's why it's known as the Colón Theater Agreement. So after this long negotiation process and after this complex construction of legal grounds based on our internal law, the next stage was a very complicated implementation process. This may give you an idea about how complex this process was for us. So we may understand this agreement, as we already pointed out, as a ceasefire. But this would fit under the concept of negative peace. And it's not the peace that we wanted to build in Colombia. In Colombia, we wanted to build a positive peace which implied the respect of rights, the decrease of inequality, the need to redistribute land. It wasn't enough just to sign. There was the need to build, and this peace building, in peace building, international cooperation had a very important role, especially the cooperation model implemented by the European Union. The European Union implements a model that's based on development. The European vision of development is currently connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is sort of like cascade between all the different elements that allows us to understand why the EU is carrying out cooperation in Colombia in the peace-building framework. To wrap up, we are going to talk about education. Why did I decide to focus on education projects? Well, I did so because education is an essential element for reincorporation, and reincorporation is an essential element for peace building with the meaning of positive peace. If we see the precedents of the conflict in Colombia, we can see how there are alarming levels of inequality. Colombia is the second most unequal country in the region. The areas where the conflict has been more severe are places where people don't have the access to education, don't have the access to healthcare services. So the human rights approach is vital for the reintegration process. It's fundamental for these people that have been for so long living in a conflict. Many of these people haven't had the access, the possibility to access the education system. For them to be reinstated or reintegrated in society, they need tools. And education, without any doubt, is the best instrument to avoid people who haven't had access to education to be reintegrated or reinstated in society. In this sense, reintegration has three dimensions: a personal development. An ex-fighter, a former fighter, needs to feel that he or she can have a life project, maybe based on the educational system or by learning trades that allow him or her to have a job and have a different activity. And education will also improve relations in the sense that when you access the educational system, you are relating to others. This will generate a productive development because many cooperation projects are not focused on formal training, but on training for having jobs. And this really helps former fighters to reintegrate civil life. In this sense, education, the education that we talk about in this project, is education in a broad sense. We're not only talking about education in a formal way, we're also talking about this education that allows the development of productive activities. The last part of the project focuses on cooperation projects carried out currently by the European Union. Out of the 31 projects carried out by the European Union, 25 are somehow connected to education. This makes obvious the importance of the education element in the peace process in Colombia. I analyzed these projects and I identified 3 types of projects in connection to the right to education. One is the first category are the projects connected to formal education. Some of these include grants for accessing education for former fighters, and this includes minors. Many fighters joined the FARC when they were minors, when they were still underage. Other projects that show this focus on formal training are those projects that, for example, are aimed at creating infrastructures like schools in areas that have historically been plagued by violence. And this is framed under the broad concept of the right to education, and this is part of observation number 17 of the Social and Economic Council of the UN. This general observation emphasizes that access to education doesn't only imply going to school, but that schools need to have decent conditions. Imagine what schools are like in places where there's no electricity, schools in places where there is no running water. These schools cannot guarantee the right to education, so some cooperation projects developed by the European Union focus on that cooperation dimension and are aimed at developing infrastructures. So this is the first category of projects, education projects. We identified a second group that is very relevant in the reintegration process, and it's the one connected to education for human development. These projects involve different courses to develop productive capacities. I'm going to give some examples. For example, beekeeping, crop replacement. Remember that one of the main problems, one of the triggers for violence in Colombia is that in many of these areas there are unlawful crops. So this process of teaching former fighters new crops, new productive ways has been vital. There's, for example, training in demining, and this is connected to the peacekeeping approach. And then we have a third category of projects that is peace education in per se, that is training to help people relate to each other in a peaceful way. We're talking about people that have been involved in a project since they were children. So it's important to build capacity. In some ways, we're talking about psychological capacity building to help understand people the new concept and the new context, a context of peace. So with this, I finish this part of my presentation, and I'm going to start with the conclusions, the outcomes. My findings is that are the following. The first one is that the expanded concept of cooperation of the European Union is an expanded concept. Cooperation is not limited to eliminating poverty. It's broader, and it includes a solidarity approach, respect of rights, etc. And there's a second major finding, and this second major finding is that cooperation for development, as it is put forward by the European Union, although it generates benefits for the EU, for example, geopolitical benefits or economical benefits, this does not undermine the solidarity character of cooperation. Only this type of approach would explain international cooperation in the framework of the contents of the treaties and case law. And finally, the third major finding in my work is that cooperation carried out by the EU in Colombia is cooperation that focuses on development, as shown by the cooperation projects carried out. If we analyze all the cooperation projects by the European Union, 25 out of 31 projects have an educational approach, which shows the importance of education in the reintegration process and in the process of building positive peace. Thank you very much.